Welcome back. We're discussing on the programme today leadership in ASEAN. Do employers have the right formula for success? According to a Gallup report, company managers in the region fail to engage their workers and succession planning is weak. So how can companies adjust their approach to developing leaders? In the second part of the programme, we're joined by Henrik Bresman, who's Professor of Organisational Behaviour and Academic Director at INSEAD Global Leadership Centre. He's also the Academic Director of the HEAD Foundation. Still with us, Dr. Roland Smith, Vice President of the Asia Pacific Centre for Creative Leadership. Henrik, you heard our conversation in part one of the show, and one of the problems of discussing management, leadership, development of human capital is always that there are so many opinions. You only have to go into an airport bookshop to see a million different perspectives on how this should be done. So in the light of what we've spoken of, tell us how you break down the issue of leadership in Asia.
Well, first of all, I think that the report was very solid and the conclusions are very valid. The important outstanding question to me is, so what then? How to implement? The proof in the end is in the pudding. And I think one important piece there that is specific to companies working in ASEAN is the fact that what we see is that in young companies, small companies, mid-sized companies, there's plenty of innovation and adaptability. In the large companies, much less so. So Asian companies seem to have been unable to combine largeness with innovation and leadership. So
when you say how to implement, can you tell us what to implement?
Specifically, what it boils down to is that we need not only leadership development, but also organizational development. We need organizations to develop in a way that leaders can develop in.
So you're saying that organizations basically need to apply their thinking towards how to develop their workforces in a methodical way.
They need to distribute the leadership task to where the best capabilities and information is found. Currently, that's a weakness for Asian companies, we find.
We spoke in the first half about creativity in this context. I mean, and specifically about maybe some of the cultural restrictions on perhaps creative solutions. Speak a little bit more, Roland, about whether creativity is an issue specifically in management context and whether it differs in ASEAN around the rest of the world, or are the problems all the same everywhere?
Well, I think, we look at transformation at the Center for Creative Leadership as three elements, three foundational pillars: strategy, culture, and talent. Strategy is usually all right, and the strategy talks that we want to be creative, we want to be innovative. We look at then, do we have the right people? That's this discussion about talent. But the piece that we don't often talk about is the culture. And the culture is actually what needs to be addressed for not only organizations to be innovative, but also to attract and keep talent. And so part of this journey is most organizations around the world and in Asia get their strategy right, or right enough. They struggle around looking at how to get the talent developed. Oftentimes they spend more time hunting for the new talent versus developing their own. But oftentimes the culture of the organization, the culture of the region, is not addressed in an open and direct way.
We have a immigration political issue involved in all this, and you mentioned expats in the first half. Those considerations, those political considerations, how much of a problem do they pose at an organizational level?
I actually think so. I agree completely with the importance of culture. What we find in the research at INSEAD and at the HEAD Foundation is that that block is usually found at the organizational level. Culture blocks information to flow down to the leaders who have the best information, so they don't have the strategic mindset that they need to take on leadership roles.
Is there a distinction between political culture and culture with a small c? I mean, we talked about kiasuism and losing face and things like that. I'm just wondering whether national political priorities are something that are worth of consideration in this context.
Absolutely. So that's the larger context. But there is, and I think that Roland mentioned Unilever as an example of one organization that has been able to override some of that and found its own culture, which is different from the culture of the same company in Europe. I think it's important to mention. So it is very much possible to both to promote a local culture that is differentiated from the political country culture.
So, I mean, I started off by saying, is the responsibility for development and for addressing some of these problems with the employer or with the government? How does that play out? I mean, is that the right question to ask even?
Well, I think the macro question is right, and the answer, the consulting answer is both. But governments actually need to start early leadership education sooner. You know, we did a piece in Indonesia where we asked at an economic forum the leaders what age they thought leadership education should start. And they indicated that they thought it should start in the teens, if not sooner. I think that's an important place where governments can play, not just teaching leadership education, but more specifically improving the education of the youth. And you can speak to that as well.
Absolutely. We are working in Indonesia right now at the HEAD Foundation and at INSEAD, working with the government to see how we can increase and improve leadership development in the younger generation. Research we've done on the millennial generation shows a strong will to become leaders, but they lack the tools.
As we talk about culture, let me just venture out into slightly sensitive territory. I mean, we're sitting here talking about these ideas, and both of you are expatriates, and you're bringing with you ideas that are mostly incubated and developed, probably in academic circles in the West. How applicable are they in this context? And when you speak to your peers in local universities and in local think tanks and development centers, do you find differences and different priorities and approaches are problematic, or is there a convergence towards the same ideas?
There is convergence and there is divergence. So you have globalization forces that creates convergence, but then there are also divergence. And particularly for young leaders, this seems to translate into a question of how can I be myself, which is a kind of individualism that comes from globalization, the spread of technology, Facebook, etc. But also how can I still belong? Which is a much stronger question here and rooted in this culture. Now, if you're able to bridge the two, I see Asian leadership really be world-beating.
You know, I think just to clarify something, you know, for 10 years ago, the Singapore government brought the Center for Creative Leadership, encouraged us to come here because they didn't want a Western perspective on our leadership research. They wanted an Eastern perspective. So for the last 10 years, our research, our efforts have been to look at localized issues by country, by region, and then compare it in aggregate. So it gets at the same point that you're making, and there are certain things that all people want and all talent want. People want to belong, they don't want to be disrespected, they want to have opportunity, they want to be safe, and they want to think or believe that they have a future. I think this discussion about talent and what organizations can do is create the environment or the conditions where humans flourish. Governments attempt to do that, but even with these new legislative laws about fluid and fungible talent, there are still going to be issues about that person from that country taking that job. What we need to do is continue to work with organizations and institutions and government to break down those barriers and create this environment where we are working to have the conditions where humans and individuals flourish.
And are we able to measure the amount of difference it makes when these efforts are properly implemented and properly applied? I mean, in terms of GDP growth, we started the program saying ASEAN's potential depends upon it being able to improve its talent pool. But if they just bumble along as before, what practical impact would it have on the region's growth, do you think?
Well, so I'll give you the academic answer and then my personal answer. One of the things that is really at the leading edge is can we measure the outcomes? And there are measures of outcomes on increased performance at the organizational unit level, etc. But I have to say that for many of us who does this work, in the end it boils down to creating organizations with dignity and meaning, and that makes us tick. How we measure that, well, often we see it in the eyes of our participants in our programs, but the measures can certainly be improved.
Well, and for us, you know, I think we've talked about how we can help government, how we can help organizations overall. Well, frankly, the work that Center for Creative Leadership is we find those companies that are committed to talent ecosystems, who have a talent mindset, who already have figured out that they need to do something different, and they work to behave in a way that not only keeps the talent they have, but attracts the best and creates this brand, if you will, of, hey, I want to work for that organization because I feel good working there. It makes a difference.
Roland Smith, Henrik Bresman, thank you very much indeed for being with us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's show.